This week on The Inside Story, U.S. President Donald Trump addresses Congress and the nation and lays out his ambitious plans for a second term. We'll lay out the main points, get reaction to his speech, and learn what it could mean at home and abroad. All that now on The Inside Story.
Hello and welcome to The Inside Story. I'm Carla Babb. We begin this week with President Donald Trump's speech to a joint session of Congress. It was a chance for Trump to clearly spell out his administration's priorities in a second term. The event itself was pure Washington, full of circumstance, pomp, and politics. Patsy Widakuswara has more on this annual piece of American history.
President Donald Trump's Tuesday evening speech marks his first address to a joint session of Congress since he began his second term on January 20.
America's momentum is back, our spirit is back, our pride is back, our confidence is back, and the American dream is surging bigger and better than ever before.
But barely 5 minutes in, the Democratic Representative Al Green of Texas began shouting that Trump had, quote, no mandate to cut Medicaid, the government aid program for medical coverage for low-income people.
Mr. Green, take your seat. Take your seat, sir.
Green was escorted out. Trump highlighted the steep tariffs he enacted Tuesday on China and U.S. neighbors Mexico and Canada. These top three U.S. trading partners have threatened retaliation, sending financial markets tumbling amid fears of a new trade war.
There'll be a little disturbance, but we're okay with that. It won't be much.
Earlier this week, Trump paused military aid to Ukraine, following last week's combative Oval Office meeting with President Volodymyr Zelensky over a deal that would give the U.S. rights to Ukrainian rare earth minerals. It's part of his efforts to press Kyiv to take a deal to end the fight against Russia's invasion of the country.
Simultaneously, we've had serious discussions with Russia and have received strong signals that they are ready for peace.
In delivering the Democrats' response, Senator Elisa Slotkin of Michigan highlighted Trump's fiery exchange with Zelensky.
And that scene in the Oval Office wasn't just a bad episode of reality TV. It summed up Trump's whole approach to the world. He believes in cozying up to dictators like Vladimir Putin and kicking our friends like the Canadians in the teeth. He sees American leadership as merely a series of real estate transactions.
Other Democrats signaled their protest while Trump spoke, wearing pink to call attention to Trump's policies they say negatively impact women and families, and holding signs including Musk steals.
Doge. Perhaps you've heard of it. Perhaps.
Referring to efforts by tech billionaire Elon Musk to slash federal bureaucracy by canceling government contracts and firing tens of thousands of federal employees.
Any federal bureaucrat who resists this change will be removed from office immediately. Because we are draining the swamp.
Again, the Democrats' response from Slotkin.
You want to cut waste? I'll help you do it. But change doesn't need to be chaotic or make us less safe. The mindless firing of people who work to protect our nuclear weapons, keep our planes from crashing, and conduct the research that finds the cure for cancer, only to rehire them 2 days later? No CEO in America could do that without being summarily fired.
Trump credited himself for the drop in the number of migrants illegally crossing the U.S. southern border.
The media and our friends in the Democrat Party kept saying we needed new legislation, we must have legislation to secure the border. But it turned out that all we really needed was a new president.
Sitting with First Lady Melania Trump were guests whose life experiences amplify her husband's agenda, including an activist against transgender athletes in women's sports and the family of a woman killed by an undocumented immigrant. Trump repeated his calls to take back the Panama Canal and take over Greenland, but not his demands to expel Palestinians from Gaza. He spoke for an hour and 40 minutes, the longest presidential speech to Congress. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
For a reaction on the president's speech, we go back to Capitol Hill to hear from lawmakers.
So I think the biggest takeaway from the night was peace in Ukraine, peace in Russia, peace in the region is now seemingly achievable because both sides seem to move towards negotiation. So, the rest of the speech, he obviously covered a lot of ground, a lot to digest, but I think that the key point about it is peace with Ukraine and Russia, which the whole world wants, is a little closer.
It was an exciting moment, not only for us here in the House, but for all of America. President Trump laid out his plan for the next 4 years. He's going to keep securing the border. He's going to make America prosperous again, secure again, and give us back the American dream.
One thing Donald Trump did not mention last night was a real serious plan to bring down costs, the number one thing Americans wanted to hear most. Instead, Donald Trump doubled down on his plans to send costs skyrocketing by starting a trade war with Canada and Mexico.
Republicans aren't trying to bring the country together. They are tearing us apart. Republicans aren't trying to move America forward. They want to turn back the clock.
Man, the gloves are off, but it really is all about being the gloves off for America, because the optimism he brings and the policy he lays out, they just make sense.
I think we need to support Ukraine. They're a critical ally. We made commitments to Ukraine that we need to keep, and I believe in honoring America's word.
He gave a great speech in there tonight. It was a man that showed confidence. He knew exactly what his mission was going to be, and he knows how to communicate with the American people.
For analysis of the president's address, we're now joined by Bradley Bowman, the senior director of the Center of Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Bradley, thank you so much for joining us. Let's dive right into the surprise of the night. We found out that there was a top terrorist, the ISIS terrorist who was responsible for the atrocity in 2021 during America's withdrawal from Afghanistan, that massive bombing at the Kabul airport that killed 13 American service members, countless other Afghans. President Trump announced that he has been apprehended. Can you tell us more about how this happened?
Yeah, absolutely. The individual in question is Mohammed Sharifullah, known as Jafar, and he was evidently in Afghan government custody until, according to the FBI affidavit, until about a few weeks before the horrible attack at Abbey Gate was released. And as many of these terrorists do, once released, they go back, big surprise, to terrorism, and was approached by ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan, the Afghanistan affiliate of ISIS, to go ahead and basically serve as a scout for ISIS and conduct surveillance or reconnaissance of the route by which the suicide bomber would later traverse and see if they thought that the bomber could get to the gate and then murder the people there. He relayed that information, and then the attack occurred. And then, as you said, we had 13 U.S. service members murdered and approximately 160 civilians killed. And so he was in Pakistani detention, evidently, and the U.S. government reached out to them, and he is now in the United States and is facing charges. I think it sends the message that if you harm U.S. service members, the U.S. government, regardless of administration, will do what's necessary to find you and bring you to justice.
Yeah, even several years later, amazing news. Yeah. President Trump also announced a new Office of Shipbuilding in the White House, which he said would help build national security. This is a problem that VOA is exploring in some reports that are coming out in recent days and soon to come. You and I have discussed this a lot vis-a-vis China. China has a big advantage on the U.S. right now. Talk a little bit about this change and why you think it's going up to the White House.
You know, I think this is a welcome announcement by the Trump administration. You know, an office and some tax incentives, while laudable, won't solve the problem, but they do suggest this administration understands the problem and wants to focus on it. And this is a problem. In fact, problem is probably not strong enough wording. I'd say we have a crisis. We have a shipbuilding crisis in this country. We have insufficient shipbuilding capacity, and the ships, and by ships I mean ships and submarines that we're producing are often late and over budget. We got a real problem, and the People's Liberation Army Navy, a weird name, but the name for their Navy is larger than ours. And by the way, our Navy is trying to cover and protect our interests around the world, while the Chinese Navy, while increasingly venturing farther afield, is focusing a lot of their naval power on East Asia. And so that creates a real mismatch.
Bradley, what about the border? The president mentioned the U.S. southern border several times. Officials went to the border this week for another look on what the U.S. military is doing to try to help law enforcement efforts there to do what Secretary of Defense Hegseth said would be gaining 100% operational control. Tell us a little bit about the additions and how they are affecting interventions.
You know, when he was president, Trump was a candidate. He really emphasized the border. And I'd say President Trump is putting his money where his mouth is in terms of focusing on the border. And the U.S. military is involved. Roughly, we're talking about 9,000 U.S. service members on the border, fulfilling a variety of different functions. It's administrative support, aviation support, transportation support, warehousing, logistics, vehicle maintenance, engineering, these sorts of things to help support the civilian agencies that are in the lead there on the border. And as a result, there has been a significant decline in illegal entries into the United States.
Well, lots to talk about after that speech. Bradley Bowman with FDD, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
In his address, the president said he had received a letter from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
The letter reads, Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer. Nobody wants peace more than the Ukrainians, he said. We do really value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence. Regarding the agreement on minerals and security, Ukraine is ready to sign it at any time that is convenient for you. I appreciate that he sent this letter, just got it a little while ago.
Joining us now is Ostap Yarish from VOA's Ukrainian service. Ostap, we know this mineral deal would bring the United States $500 billion in potential revenue from minerals, oil, and gas. What would Ukraine get from this deal?
Carla, thank you for having me. Well, we don't know for sure if the U.S. would get $500 billion from this deal. We also don't know how long it would take to get any development of minerals and get them from Ukraine to the United States. When asked last week about how much the U.S. is expecting to get from the deal, President Trump replied that it was difficult to say because that would require some detailed on-site research and more work on the ground there in Ukraine. But of course, according to President Trump, it will definitely bring some revenue back to the United States. The draft of the agreement that we've seen says that the deal will create or would create some sort of an investment fund to which Ukraine will direct 50% of all the revenue from oil and gas and other developments in Ukraine. And that fund would also create the future investment or monetization for Ukrainian development projects or reconstruction projects that would be made on the territory of Ukraine. This deal, however, does not include or doesn't specify any security guarantees from the United States to Ukraine. The U.S. says that would be Europe's part, that Europe should invest more in its own defense and should take more responsibility when it comes to security guarantees for Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine says that they need strong reassurances from the U.S., from the partners, and they hope that they can work those out down the road, and that this deal would be the first step and would create some sort of framework for the future cooperation.
So potentially there is a lot of money on the line here for both sides.
That's true, yeah, but coming back to the security guarantees from the White House standpoint, it's also important they say that they think this deal itself would be the best security guarantee for Ukraine. They say that economic presence of America in Ukraine, co-investment with the United States, would prevent anyone from attacking Ukraine in the future, and that would be the best guarantee Ukraine can hope for. That was National Security Advisor's Mike Waltz's words.
Going back to that Oval Office meeting last week, tensions grew when President Zelensky raised concerns about diplomacy with Russia because Moscow did sign a ceasefire agreement with Kyiv in 2019, only for Moscow to invade Ukraine again in 2022. So if President Trump can get these two, Zelensky and Putin, if he can actually get them to the negotiating table, What are you hearing that Ukrainians want most?
Carla, we speak to Ukrainians a lot, and what we are hearing from them, that they want peace more than anyone. And of course, that's true because they have suffered enough for 11 years of this war. It began back in 2014 when Russia attacked for the first time. Of course, then it launched its full-scale invasion in 2022. But since 2014, lots of Ukrainians have died, they have lost their homes. And of course, they want to have peace as soon as possible. But at the same time, Carla, they want to have a lasting peace, that they want to have not a temporary agreement that Russia would potentially break in a couple of months or in 2 years or after President Trump leaves the office. Of course, also Ukrainians, what they want, what we hear from them, they want this peace to be a just peace. We know that there are a lot of prisoners of war that Russia still keeps in their prisons. Ukrainians want them back. Many of those prisoners of war, by the way, are not only military, they're civilians. Some of them are journalists. We know that my former colleague back in Kyiv, when I used to work there, Victoria Roshina, last year we learned that she was killed in the captivity. So there are lots of stories like that. On top of that, Russia still keeps more than 19,000 of Ukrainian children that they kidnapped from Ukraine. Ukrainians, of course, want them back to their families. Lots of those children still have families or relatives back in Ukraine. So that's what we hear from people on the ground in Ukraine. And of course, those people that we speak to, they want to see that after peace, there is some accountability for the war crimes that Russia committed in Ukraine. They want to see that Russia doesn't get away with what they committed back in Ukraine, and it's not rewarded by getting back to business as usual.
Well, just and lasting peace.
Absolutely.
Ostap, thank you so much for your insights. Ostap Yarish from VOA's Ukrainian service. Thank you very much. On Monday, President Donald Trump ordered a pause to military aid shipments to Ukraine with immediate effect, which his administration said was aimed at forcing all sides to peace talks. As Henry Ridgewell reports from London, European leaders have said it is vital to continue weapons shipments to Kyiv, but there are doubts over how long Ukraine can keep fighting.
As news broke overnight Monday of the US decision to halt military aid to Kyiv, Russian drones continued to rain down on Ukrainian cities. Ukrainian lawmakers say the consequences of Washington's decision will be stark.
This means that thousands of people will die.
West of Donetsk, Ukraine, near the town of Pokrovsk, the war grinds on.
We fire an Italian howitzer, but we get a lot of ammunition, including 105mm caliber from the U.S. It is NATO standard, which is used in both Europe and the U.S. But whether Europe will be able to supply us, I hope it will.
Can Europe make up for the shortfall of military aid from the US?
There are certain systems ranging from Patriot missiles all the way through to spare parts for the Abrams tanks and Bradley personnel carriers that the Ukrainians are using, that the only way the Europeans can get is by buying them on the open market, and that is going to take time.
But Ukraine is increasingly producing its own weapons.
Probably about half the weapons which Ukraine is now using are provided by its own defense industry. And of the remainder, it's about half and half between the United States and the others, including the Europeans.
The US provides other crucial assistance, including shipping Western weapons into Ukraine.
And finally, the US plays a very important role in providing information intelligence to the Ukrainian forces.
The Trump administration says the halt in military aid is, quote, to ensure that it is contributing to a solution.
Neither Europe nor the United States nor the Ukrainians can continue this war indefinitely. So it's important that everybody come to the table.
Britain's Prime Minister said Sunday that a coalition of the willing would continue to support Ukraine.
Vice President Vance's claim that a lot of the European leaders who on social media and in public are foursquare behind Kyiv, but in private they're actually much more skeptical, is not entirely incorrect. Do you essentially continue to hollow out your own armed forces and also alienate your most powerful security ally and guarantor in the name of defending Ukraine?
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky appealed to the Trump administration Tuesday, writing on X that Ukraine was committed to peace. For Ukrainians suffering under Russian bombardment, the cut in US aid is a bitter outcome.
I hope that he will change his mind. The victim of aggression cannot be guilty of everything and be punished in addition to that.
Maybe Europe can help somehow. The hope is only on Europe now, no one else.
Russia, meanwhile, welcomed Washington's decision to halt military aid to Ukraine, saying it may help, quote, to settle the situation by peaceful means. Henry Ridgwell, VOA News.
Well, tariffs were also mentioned in the speech, and they are a cornerstone of President Trump's foreign, domestic, and economic policies. To better understand how tariffs impact some small American businesses, VOA senior Washington correspondent Carolyn Pursuti visited a family whiskey business in the hills of Virginia.
It's mashing day at Catoctin Creek Distilling Company. The bubbling rye lends an aroma of baked bread.
Rye was the original. It was really where it started.
Becky and Scott Harris distill rye whiskey. Rye spirits were aged in Virginia more than 100 years before the country's first tariffs. Foreign tariffs sealed into law by the nation's first president, George Washington. Now, tariffs under the country's current president are upsetting this company's attempts to sell its rye whiskey abroad.
This makes exports a much harder lift, right? Because anybody buying my products then has to pay that tariff. And that's something that they won't do.
Not only is distribution in Mexico and Canada impacted, but also raw materials like these glass bottles, even though they are made in America. Big producers typically buy Mexican and Chinese glass, but after the U.S. presidential election, they switched to the American company.
We may actually run out of American glass in the next 2 months and have to order some imported glass at a higher price in order to keep product flowing.
The Harris's planned expansion to Mexico and Canada is crushed, with Canadian shop owners now removing their rye whiskey and other American-made liquor from store shelves.
We were in process of getting an order from France, and the French distributor told us that no, it's just not a good time now for American products to go over there.
President Donald Trump says imposing tariffs will motivate world leaders to stop the flow of illegal immigrants and drugs.
But we need Mexico and Canada to do much more than they've done, and they have to stop the fentanyl and drugs pouring into the USA. They're going to stop it.
The president's supporters understand tariffs.
But the tariffs, I think, are necessary for leverage, okay? And to make things fair when it comes to us purchasing things from other countries purchasing things from us.
The stock market disagreed, tumbling 2 straight days on Wall Street.
The hope has to be that the stock market's decline will cause the administration to dial back on this trade policy, because a trade war is really a lose-lose proposition.
But until then, Lothman says the cycle of tariffs and retaliatory tariffs will continue over and over again. Carolyn Pursuti, VOA News, Purcellville, Virginia.
Presidents traditionally invite guests of honor to witness their historic words from the House chamber. One incredibly touching moment was when President Trump introduced DJ Daniel. There he is, who he said had always wanted to be a police officer. The 13-year-old cancer survivor received a standing ovation as he was officially sworn into the Secret Service during the speech. That's all for this edition of The Inside Story. Thanks for watching. I'm Carla Babb. And stay tuned to voanews.com for all the latest news affecting the world and your world. See you next week for another version of The Inside Story.
This is the voice
of America. Washington, DC.